Welcome back to Wetaskiwin-Composite High School, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're looking at a A2, and it's our first A2 of the year. We have spent nearly half of our course together, and we still haven't looked at an essay yet. So you must have been just hoping that this day would come soon. So this is our essay. So let's say you come into a class next year when we have 65-minute classes and you have to write an A2 quickly. And you flip it over, and it reads this. What do you possibly do? What's your first step? Anybody want to weigh in? What might you do? Panic? Yeah, that's a good one. Get up, walk out, and register for lower stream. These are very good suggestions. Any other ideas? You might read the source. Yeah, before you panic, you might want to read the source, and then you panic. So nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. Only an educated citizenry can ensure that nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. So you read it once to get the big picture. So big picture, what is the theme of this A2 source? You're right, nationalism. That was brilliant. So this year in 20, it's always going to be nationalism. Last year, even the essays that you didn't think it was, they were all about globalization. So if you thought it wasn't about globalization, maybe that's why you failed that essay. And then next year in 30, it'll be about liberalism. It'll be about ideologies. It'll be about our relationships with each other and to our government. But this year it's about nationalism. So the theme of the source is nationalism. Now, with regards to a theme, sources are going to have an ideological perspective. Generally speaking, what are the two perspectives that it could be this or that? What are the two possible perspectives? Yeah?
It could be against nationalism or it could defend.
Yeah, it could be either against it or in favor of it. Generally, in this binary world that we live in, this yes or no existence that we have, this on or off, either nationalism's good or bad, either it's in favor of it or against it. So like a CSI investigator, this is our crime scene, and we have to look for clues in the words to see, is the ideological perspective here in favor of nationalism? Is it a proponent of nationalism? Or is it against nationalism? Is it an opponent of nationalism? So what we do after we read it one time through, we found that it's about nationalism. And now we have to look back and say, okay, with regards to nationalism, is it a proponent or an opponent? We're going to go back and look at the clues. We're going to look at key words. What are our key words here? Do you see any key words? If you can go ahead and on your page circle some key words, I'm going to use the highlighting feature in a moment, and I'll highlight some key words and phrases. This is where I get paid to do nothing. I'm just sitting here like a photo radar guy on the side of the road driving to Edmonton. They're just sitting there. So key words and key phrases. Nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. Only an educated citizenry can ensure that nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. Give me one key term or key phrase. Yes? Educated citizenry. So we're going to have to do something with that. We're going to have to unpack that in some way. Boop. There we go. We'll come back to that. So this is where you would highlight the key phrases so that you know that these are the things you must analyze to find a perspective, to be able to, before you respond to it, figure out what is it that I'm responding to. That is definitely a key phrase. Any other key phrases? Yes? Mobilizing myths. Mobilizing myths. No, I almost clicked the wrong thing. Boop. That's a little dark. I'm sure I like that. It's intimidatingly dark. Boop. There, that looks better. So we got two key phrases. Any other key phrases? Yes, sir.
Overriding principle.
Overriding principle. What's your favorite color? Nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. Only an educated citizenry can ensure that nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. Any other big rocks? Any other key phrases? Yes?
Doesn't.
That's definitely a directing term. With doesn't, you can find probably perspective quite easy, right? Yeah, there's a tone there. Yeah.
Created and controlled.
The fun thing is, the longer we, whoop, I didn't want to do that. The longer we do this, we end up highlighting everything, right? Lots of key things there. Anything else you guys want to speak to passionately? Nationalism. So if you wrote an essay, and at no point in your essay did you mention nationalism, kind of running out of colors, then you would agree that maybe the essay is incomplete. If you wrote an essay and at no point did you talk about educated citizens, your essay is incomplete. If you write an essay here and you don't talk about mobilizing myths, your essay is incomplete. If you don't talk about overriding principles or nations being created and controlled, your essay is incomplete. Incomplete essays, you get 40%. So in order to get above 40%, we must unpack what these key words and phrases mean and then respond to each and every one of them. Next year in 65 minutes. So, lots to do. Now, you may remember back from Social 10, we often talked about the source can be broken down into a problem, highlighted by the source, and a solution. And by looking at the solution, we can better understand its ideological perspective connected to nationalism. Is the solution promoting more nationalism and showing nationalism as a solution, or against nationalism? So before we can get to that, what is the problem highlighted in the source? Yes?
Nationalism becoming an overriding principle.
Okay? So that could be seen as a problem, that we want to avoid nationalism becoming an overriding principle. Any other problems that you guys saw within the source? What's the solution? How can we avoid nations or nationalism becoming an overriding principle? What's the solution here?
Educated citizenry.
Okay, so this is the solution. So if that's the case, then can we just delete the first sentence? What's the importance of the first sentence? Nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. If the solution is educated citizenry, and the problem is nations becoming, or nationalism becoming an overriding principle, what's the significance of that first sentence? How does that first sentence connect to the second one? Yes?
It's another problem.
It's the source of the problem, right? That this causes, or potentially could cause that. So this, and then worst case scenario, might lead to that. And how do we prevent that? And I can't spell scenario. Just to make you feel better about yourself, I'm going to make some mistakes. This is for you. For you. So we prevent the worst case scenario through an educated citizenry. Nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. That's the problem. The problem is significant because if left unaddressed, it will become an overriding principle. Now, is the problem explicit or implicit? Is the problem explicit, being that based upon the language on the page, we know exactly what's going to happen, or is there something that we have to infer? Therefore, there's something implicit about the problem. Implicit. So, it says that worst case scenario, nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle, but this is implicit. Because why is it implicit? Nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. What it doesn't do is unpack. Well, what does that look like? What does it look like when nationalism becomes an overriding principle? So there's vagueness in the language, very purposeful vagueness, because we want you as a student to be forced to unpack that. You have to explain to me what that means. So there is some very strategic vagueness surrounding nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. Meaning what, right? The meaning what is a part of your job in the analysis of source. Explain to me, what does that mean to become an overriding principle? Explicit might mean something like nationalism doesn't lead to a destruction of the economy, or nationalism doesn't lead to, genocide or something like that. That's very explicit. That's very specific. But nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. There's still some unpacking needed. How do we unpack that then? How do we unpack the idea, this vision, nationalism could become an overriding principle? How would you demonstrate your understanding of what that means? When the source suggests that worst case scenario, nationalism could become an overriding principle, this could be a reference to ... What's your ... Yeah? Maybe French Revolution. During the French Revolution, if you're trying to prove to me, if you're trying to quantify the claim that during the French Revolution, nationalism became an overriding principle, then nationalism would have to be a principle that overrode what? Other principles. Principles like feudalism, principles like Catholicism, principles like morality, so that this sense of nationalism became their main principle to which they decided proper behavior. And because of that, it led to, the Reign of Terror. Yeah, you could do that. Looking ahead to the unit that we have now, 1919 to 1945, what might be some evidence that we're going to study that would give us some insight into nations where nationalism became an overriding principle? That the idea of nationalism became the dominant thing, that when you make your decisions, nationalism must be the most important principle. Everything else is subject to nationalism. What might be the case study that is going to teach us that? Case study could be a word, or it could be a place. Where are we likely to find nationalism becoming an overriding principle? During war. Yeah, we're definitely going to find it during war. So in Nazi Germany, they're going to have a policy called Gleichschaltung. And Gleichschaltung was this idea that everything was Nazified. So if you wanted to have a bowling club, it was a Nazi bowling club. You wanted to have a gardener's club or a book club, these were all going to be funneled underneath the umbrella of the Nazi Party, so that the Nazis could control all aspects of your life. We're going to see in the case study of Hitler's Germany a policy called Gleichschaltung that is an overriding principle. So when the source says nationalism could become an overriding principle, it happens historically in Hitler's Germany. When nationalism becomes an overriding principle, do we have another name for it? Do we have another name for nationalism when nationalism becomes an overriding principle? Yes, sir. It's almost like it's the lesson of the day, right? Today's lesson is ultra-nationalism, an extreme version of nationalism. And when you talk about nationalism becoming this overriding principle, it's not explicitly said. They don't use the term ultra-nationalism, but we can add that term to what is being said. That when the source is suggesting that nationalism can become an overriding principle, it's referring to ultranationalism, as demonstrated during Gleichschaltung in Hitler's Germany, during the policy of Gleichschaltung. So what we've done there is we've tried to take the language and we tried to unpack it. When it says this, it means that. So when we study fascism, we must look for the overriding principles within fascism. When we study communism, we have to look for the overriding principles within communism. So that when you are writing this essay at the end of the unit, you can show me that you understood communism and fascism ideologically, but you also understood them as based on their overriding principles within them, and how these overriding principles shape nations. This essay is the ultimate test of this unit that we're about to do. Knowing the essay at the beginning of the unit gives you direction throughout the unit. As we study communism and fascism in the days to come, you have to look and say, okay, what are the overriding principles here, and how is it changing the nations? Nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. When you analyze the source, you should critically come up with thoughts like, nations are created by who? Who's creating the nation? What type of nation is this? Are we talking about the Germanic nation being created in the 19th century through blood and iron with the policies of Otto von Bismarck on behalf of the Kaiser? Are we talking about the modern nation state of Italy being created by Mazzini and Cavour and Garibaldi? Nations are created. When you analyze that, your analytical mind should be saying, nations are created by who? And taking a step back, nations are created, what type of nation? Are we talking about linguistic nations? Probably not. Are we talking about socioeconomic nations? Are we talking about cultural nations? Are we talking about civic nations? When the source says nations are created, what type of nation can we infer that they're talking about? That's your analysis. When the source says nations are created and controlled, the word control has a tone attached. The ideological perspective of the source begins to be exposed through the word and the usage of the word controlled. What kind of tone comes with the word controlled? What kind of tone comes with the word control? Yeah, I want you to think critically for a minute. We have one hand up, and I appreciate that. How many people in here like to be controlled? Maybe you like it. Maybe you're into that sort of stuff. Maybe you like to have a dominant boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever in your life. That's probably not something for us to talk about further on camera, or even after the camera closes. Let's be honest. That's not part of the curriculum here today or any day. It's not going to be the lesson plan. There are Canadians right now protesting against Justin Trudeau and the current increase in carbon tax. There are Canadians that protested during COVID-19. They didn't want to wear masks. They didn't want to get vaccines. There are people protesting not just in Canada, but globally against their governments. You, as an adolescent, you probably had times where you protested against people that are in controlling influence in your lives. I could definitely fabricate some protest against my control in this class if I wanted to play a little experiment. I could lead you to rebelling against me. I could manufacture your discontent. Because human nature, to some extent, is that we crave to be free. We do not wish to be controlled. Maybe controlled at times when it provides temporary safety, but we don't want to live a life of complete submission and obedience. So if we imply or infer that human condition is to crave freedom, then we can see that through the use of the word control, this is an anti-nationalism perspective. That nations are created to control. Well, we don't maybe want to be controlled. And therefore there's an omission, right? The source is biased because it's omitting all of the good things that nations do for us. Or it's not acknowledging that control is sometimes necessary. So a limitation of the source is it's saying nations are created to control us, but it doesn't show us why we must need to be controlled. It's ignoring the Hobsonian idea that it's our human nature that forces us to need to be controlled because we're violent and irrational without the control of the Leviathan. This is your analysis. The source says nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths, but doesn't explore whether or not we need to be controlled. It just takes it and assumes that control is bad. That's a little glimpse into analyzing words. Nations are created and controlled through mobilizing myths. Before you can carry on, what do you have to do with mobilizing myths? Yeah, you're going to have to define them. You're going to have to give me examples. So by the end of this unit, you need to collect some mobilizing myths. What was the mobilizing myths that Lenin and Marx before him handed to the proletariat? What was the mobilizing myth? What was the mobilizing myth that Hitler offers the German people? What is the mobilizing myth that Mussolini gives to the Italians? So we can find some historical, we can find some theoretical mobilizing myths. But we can also look hypothetical. There's mobilizing myths intertwined into the nuances of 1984 and Brave New World and other dystopian literature. So, by the time you hand this in, you have to know what a mobilizing myth means, and you have to be able to illustrate some examples of them. And show how a mobilizing myth can be used to create a nation. We are the workers of the world. We are the Aryan nation, or the Third Reich. And once that nation is created, that mobilizing myth is going to allow people to control you. That's what that first sentence is saying. Only an educated citizenry can ensure. What's the problem with the phrase educated citizenry? Other than the fact I stumble on pronouncing it all the time. Only an educated citizenry can control, can ensure. Yeah?
So it kind of separates people, like, sort of like inequality-wise. Yeah, you're educated, you can do it. If you're not, you suck.
Well, but I believe in meritocracy, so, and I find it ironic that the student with the highest mark in class is pointing that out. But so be it. But yeah, the idea of an educated citizenry can do this and others cannot is quite divisive. And it creates a new us versus them, one based on merit. That is a layer. And probably the most real layer globally that there exists. Only an educated citizenry. Any other issues that you see with that? Yes?
It's only presenting one solution.
Yeah, it's only presenting one solution. So it's ignoring others. So you can try to problem solve, come up with some other solutions, like something. Be Hitler for a moment. Okay, put on Hitler's hat. Did he wear hats? I guess he has a hat on there, like a little hat. Like Hitler probably wouldn't wear hats like this, like a nice little green derby. But put on the Hitler hat for a second. Yeah.
Stupid people are easy to control.
Stupid people are easy to control. I mean, I do it every day. It's my job. Stupid people are easy to control. Sometimes the educated are even easier. Only an educated citizenry can ensure that nationalism doesn't become an overriding principle. What we're going to see with Hitler's Germany is that it's not an educated citizenry that's going to protect the people from the overriding principle. It's the education that's going to deliver the overriding principle. Education is going to be the path to indoctrinate the overriding principle. Write that down. It's indoctrination.
What is it for?
Sorry, what?
What is it for?
Indoctrination. Boop. Indoctrination. Process of teaching a person or a group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. It's like brainwashing, right? Indoctrination. So we might make the observation, the argument, that only an educated citizenry, hand should go up. Well, who's defining what educated citizens look like? And if that's a publicly controlled process, then a totalitarian government could use education not as a means to be accountable and maintain legitimacy, but as a means to ensure that their overriding principle becomes written on the hearts and minds of the people. That's indoctrination. Before the Holocaust, they socially engineered people in classrooms in Germany to begin to accept genocide. So that's a layer that you'd unpack. That although the source presents an educated citizenry as a solution to the problem, it ignores the fact that in totalitarian states, the education of citizens is often a means to ensure the overriding principle is uncontested and uncontestable because people are indoctrinated. And then you give examples of indoctrination. So yeah, fun little source to analyze. You want to always talk about key terms, key phrases. If left unaddressed, how bad will things get? We might have to expand upon what's there. But we're also going to have to look at the bias, the assumptions, and the fact that not everybody's going to agree with this. Some people might say that mobilizing myths and controlling a nation, these are important things. Hobbes would disagree with the source because the source seems to suggest that we shouldn't be controlled. So it's going to be important to unpack that voice of dissent against the source. And as we do that, we're wrestling with what values the source is promoting or rejecting. More so in Social 30, but this is a step towards Social 30, I think that within this source you can talk about the role of government and the role of citizens. That this source is promoting active citizenship to hold the government accountable, to prevent tyranny. But not everybody would agree with that kind of active citizenship. We're going to see Schopenhauer, Sorel, and Gentile and others argue against citizens holding the government responsible, but rather the reverse of that. Once you have analyzed the source, then you have to respond to it. And when you respond to the source, when you create a thesis statement, you go back and look at the claims. And you unpack the source and say, if these are the claims, do I agree with each of the claims? So we've analyzed the source. You don't have this step because I didn't print it all out. But what we're going to have to do is now do some research. During this unit, we're going to have to do some research before we can actually write the body of our essay. We're going to have to look at different types of nations. Capitalist nations, communist nations, fascist, democratic, authoritarian nations, in theory. We have hypothetical nations like 1984 and Brave New World. We have ancient nations that you might remember from Social 10, like Sparta and Athens. We have historical nations that we're going to study now, or we have studied in the past. And we have some contemporary nations like Islamic fundamentalism, which apparently I misspelled, and America Today. And with each one that we study, or potential for you to study on your own, you have to look at how was the nation created? How is it controlled through a mobilizing myth? So you have to identify the myth, then see how it creates a nation, how it controls a nation. And then the source is suggesting that the control and the myth are bad. Maybe it benefits the nation. Is there evidence to argue against the source in saying that actually the mobilizing myth and the control has actually improved the nation? And then how does it harm the nation? This is the research stage of writing the essay. The first stage is analyzing the source, and we kind of brainstormed ourselves through it, but we still have some stuff we need to do, like look for the mobilizing myths. But the next stage after that, before you can actually come up with a thesis statement, is you have to do some research. You can't just come up with a thesis statement not knowing what evidence you have out there to defend your argument. So this is the research we have to do during this unit. Find the mobilizing myths, link it to the creation of nations, link it to the control of nations, and then try to evaluate, does it benefit or weaken or harm that nation? You should be looking at theory and hypothetical study, but also historical, including ancient and contemporary study. And then once we've done that research, then you should be able to come up with a thesis statement and attach that research to your thesis statements. And then, looking at the calendar for next year, write an essay in like 68 minutes. Any questions about the source? So we don't have a due date because I don't want to sprint through this unit. This is the most important unit of the year to get you ready for Social 30. So Cold War is fascinating. It's not really even meant to be a big part of 20, but we're going to study the Cold War. Canada is meant to be a big part of 20, and we'll get to Canada. But this is a big part of 30, and it allows us to look at some bigger issues that apply to Canada historically and still today. This is the heart of the course, and this essay is the skeleton of the heart. Really bad anatomy there. This is the skeleton of your heart. But this is what's going to hold this unit together. We'll have multiple choice tests. We have a ton of them, right? I'll give you a ton of multiple choice for practice, and we'll have a multiple choice test at the end. But ultimately, the exit slip in this unit, do you understand the unit, will be your essay you write on this. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to get together in groups, talk about this essay, do some planning.